The Torah tells us you have to locate the Sanhedrin. This is the High Court of Israel, has to be located exactly alongside the sanctuary in the Beis HaMikdash. How do we know this? Because the Torah juxtaposes Eila Mishpatim Asher Tosim Lifneim, these are laws you should put place before them, is juxtaposed to the building of the Mizbeach. So from here we learn that the Sanhedrin should be adjacent to the Mizbeach. So we discussed the laws yesterday that the only time that a lower court, as a court of 23, is able to issue a verdict of the death penalty, that's only if the high court, the court of 71, convenes in the Lishkas HaGozis on the Temple Mount. If they're not in session, the court of 23 cannot issue that kind of verdict. And the question is why? Of course, it's based on psukim, but what is the understanding of the linkage between the lower courts and the higher court? The Torah says explicitly that if the lower courts have a dispute among themselves, how to elucidate a Torah law, they ascend to the Temple Mount and they consult with the Sanhedrin Gedolah, and they resolve whatever the issue may be. But they directly engage with them. Here we're speaking, the court rules independent of the high court, but they are only qualified to rule if the high court is in session in that location. They convene in that location. We had mentioned that the only reason why the verdict of every court, which is a qualified court, is considered absolutely a truthful verdict is because it's based on the pasuk Elokim Nitzav B'Des Kale, that if the court convenes and they meet all the prerequisites of what an appropriate court is, Hashem convenes with them, and the court, they see through God's eyes, and therefore their ruling is considered absolute truth, because that God says that is what the ruling should be. If they don't meet that criteria, then it's questionable. And the ruling of a court, unless it's absolute in its truth, then it's not a valid ruling. And the only way it can be truthful on the absolute level is only through God's eyes. Only God convenes with that court. So if the court meets all the criteria of what a Jewish court is, then that court sees the eyes through the eyes of God. It's very interesting. We had mentioned that on Torah level, even for monetary cases, the court of 3, which is sufficient, have to be mumchim. They have to be ordained with the ordination of Moshe Rabbeinu. If not, then they're not qualified even to issue a ruling of a monetary ruling. However, because there was a problem that if a person had a monetary claim, financial claim against someone else, to be able to locate this caliber of dayan was nearly very difficult. There was such a backlog. So if a person would lend money and his borrower would give him some pushback on it, and he'd have difficulty collecting, what would be? It would discourage people from borrowing, from lending. People would stop lending. As a result of that, Chazal said, with their power of hefker bez and hefker, that even an ordinary Jew, as long as he qualifies, that he's not a thief, he hasn't violated Torah, he qualifies to sit on such a court. So 3 ordinary Jews are able to adjudicate monetary cases. But on Torah level, the verdict is not valid. It's only considered a verdict because Chazal say hefker bez and hefker. Because they say whenever the court rules, we transfer the money to the one who's must be paid. So therefore, it's not considered that the lender is taking something which he has no right to, but he's not taking as a lender collecting a debt, because it doesn't have that veracity or that absoluteness, because God doesn't convene with that court, because the dayanim are not mumchim, doesn't make a difference. The ruling is considered a legal ruling only because hefker bez hefker. So even monetary, although God does not convene with that bezdin, because God only convenes with the bezdin when it's Elokim Nitzav B'Des Kale, has to be Adas Kale, meaning it has to be the court who have that ordination, that quality of credibility doesn't make a difference. So it comes out, whatever ruling a court rules, it's always definitely a legal ruling and it's recognized by the Torah. If they're mubchin, then it's definitely because God convenes with them. And if it's monetary, although they're not mumchin, based on the principle of hefker bes and hefker, that the court, Chazal have the ability to money from one person to another, therefore the recipient of that money, based on their ruling, has a right to take that money. It's not considered illegally extracting money from one person to another. That's the understanding. What do they have to be on the Temple Mount? Again, what is the location of the Shekhinah? The Shekhinah is on the Temple Mount, the Azorah. The Torah tells us when you bring a korban, it's Lefnei Hashem. What is Lefnei Hashem? Before God? It means in the Beis Hamikdash, in the sanctuary. The court has to convene alongside that location where the Shekhinah is. That's the high court. We say Ki mitzion tetzi Torah. From Tzion, Torah emanates. Tzion is the temple. That's the Beis Hamikdash. That's where Torah emanates from. Because at that level, when you're connected at that level, then we merit the siyata d'shmaya, the divine understanding and level of clarity that we're able to issue that verdict, which God is associated with that verdict. When it comes to death penalty, to have that level of absoluteness, all the courts are linked to the high court, although there's no discussion. But when the high court convenes, then every court, lower court, have relevance, a level of connection to the Shekhinah, and it's Elokim Nitzah B'das Kale, even for a capital case, a capital verdict, and that's why they have to convene there. For that reason, I mentioned, I ended yesterday, when the buzzer rang, when we finished Shemon Esrei, we say, Yiratzl Fanecha Hashem Elokeinu Elokeinu V'seinu, Shibona Beis Hamikdash Meir V'yameinu. We ask that Hashem should build the Beis Hamikdash speedily in our time, and we should merit to have our portion of Torah. And I always mention in the Chofetz Chaim that at Sinai, all Jews were at Sinai, even the Jews who weren't yet not born, but all souls, all Jewish souls were at Sinai at the time of the giving of the Torah. And Hashem had given each neshama its chelik, its portion of Torah. No two Jews have necessarily the same portion of Torah, but whatever portion we're meant to have, we were given at Sinai. To be able to extract that portion, you have to be at a certain level. When the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, and we're going to have that level of connection with Hashem, there'll be no barriers. And because the barriers will be removed, therefore our access to Torah, which is rightfully our portion, will be able to take possession of that chelik. So that's our tefillah every day. And what the seichel came, and then we will merit to receive our portion of Torah, the portion that we received at Sinai. So that's why they have to be there. They convened there because that is the location of the Shekhinah. So to merit the ultimate level of connection and that level of clarity, which is Torah itself, therefore, that's where the high court has to convene. That's the simple approach, the way I understood it. Now, to be qualified to be a member of the Sanhedrin Gedolah, the high court, what level of proficiency do you have to have in Torah? Not only do you have to know the Torah in its entirety, not only do you have to be fully proficient in all laws of idolatry, every type of idolatry, you have to know every witchcraft. The Gemara says a Jew is not permitted to engage in witchcraft. But what about it? It's for the sake of understanding, to be able to adjudicate. I mean, how could a judge rule on a case of witchcraft, of sorcery, if he doesn't know what sorcery is? So they have to be adept in sorcery to be able to evaluate whether this is sorcery or not sorcery, maybe sleight of hand. Who said it's sorcery? It's only manipulating these nether forces through certain approaches that it's considered witchcraft, which is punishable by death. So every member of the Sanhedrin who would sit on the Sanhedrin, he'd have to be adept and fully aware of what is and what's not, whether it's idolatry, whether it's all the different types of idolatry, the means of worship. When it comes to idolatry, if it's means of worship, then the person is punished. It's punished by death, even if it's not the normal manner of worship, which is slaughtering, sprinkling blood, sacrificing of the sacrifice. Even if it's not, it's a means of worship by idolatry. A person is liable for the death penalty. But if it's the particular means which they worship that particular idol, and the person worships that deity in that manner, it's punished by death. But if he chooses his own way to worship that idol, but it's not worshipped that way, it's a Torah violation, but it's not punished by death. So the court has to be aware of what the protocols of that particular idolatry is. So the level of not, in addition, the Torah tells us Al Pi Shnai Me'edim Yokum Dover, that the court has to hear the testimony directly from the witnesses. What happens if the court doesn't understand the language of the witnesses? The witnesses who witness the act, they speak Swahili, whatever the language they speak. The court has to understand that language. Why? Because the Torah says, Al Pi Shnai Me'edim Yokum Dover. The court has to receive the testimony directly from the witnesses. It cannot go through an interpreter. If there was an interpreter involved, the testimony is not acceptable in court. Of course, it has to be directly heard. Heard means not only audibly heard, but understood by the dayanim. So if you have dayanim, you have to be literally knowledgeable of 70 languages. The story of Purim. Why was Mordechai able to foil the plot of Bigsan Viseresh, who are the gatekeepers who were going to poison Achashverosh? Because they spoke a language which they believed nobody understood. But it was within the earshot of Mordechai, and Mordechai being a member of the Sanhedrin, he understood what exactly they were plotting, and he informed Esther, his niece, that they wanted to poison the king. And that's how the plot was foiled. A person with this level of knowledge, the level of genius is not to be believed. What normally happens? A person gets carried away with his own genius. We read the Torah, the Gemara tells us that in the Beis HaMikdash, most rabbinic fences were not in effect. Ein shvus b'mikdash. Rabbinic fences were not in the Mikdash. Why? So Rashi explains in Rosh Hashanah, when you walked into the Beis HaMikdash, you felt God's presence. What's the basis for a rabbinic fence? Because a person doesn't have that level of cognizance. And at that moment, he may not be aware of something. And because of that lack of focus, he may violate the Torah law. So they created fences for those moments. When you were on the Temple Mount, there was no lapse of cognizance. You were always, because you had a sense of Hashem's presence, therefore, as a result, you were always cognizant. The Sanhedrin is as great as they were, whatever the level of genius was, but you have a sense you're in Hashem's presence, because you have a sense of the Shekhinah. You understand the level of humility is automatically natural, because you realize at that moment who you're not. And as a result of realizing who you're not, despite all that unlimited genius that these people possess and the knowledge they possess, they will have sufficient humility to be able to evaluate things as they should be evaluated. That is another value of the court convening on the Temple Mount. And as a result of that, they merit that siyata d'shmaya. But even without that, we find that a prerequisite for Torah is what? To come upon the truth of Torah, you have to have humility. That's the reason why Torah is compared to water, just as water, the Gemara tells us, flows from a high location to a low location. Identically, the Torah can only be processed and understood and retained only by a person who has a humble spirit. So if the dayanim or the shoftim of the Sanhedrin, they're not sufficiently humble, they're not going to come upon the truth. To come upon truth, you have to have humility at this very special level. Only when you're on the Temple Mount, only are they humbled, because they have a sense of Hashem's presence, and therefore they understand, as I said, who they're not, and therefore they merit that siyata d'shmaya. We just finished sharing the Aser Dibros, and the first halacha, which is discussed, of course, is the convening of Dayanim, as it says, Ela Mishpotim. Now, it says, Ashetosim Lifneim, you must present it before them. So Rashi explains what does it mean you should present it before them. Omala Kodesh Baruch Hu Moshe, Lo Salal Daitoch, Loma Eshne Lem Haperek Va'alocho Bezu Gimel Pomim. Don't think for a moment you'll teach it them once or twice or three times. That they should have the transmission to be accurate. You'll teach it once, twice, three times. But I'm not going to inconvenience myself to give them an understanding of the inner understanding and meaning of the subject matter and its commentary. You present it before them as a table which is set for immediate consumption. As you prepare food, you don't put food which is not edible. It's fully prepared to be people, whoever's going to come could fully benefit from the food. The Torah has to be presented to Shulchan Aruch, that people are able to understand and relate to all the inner workings, interactions, and all the applications of what you're teaching them. And now each person on his own level is able to extrapolate and take it what his capacity is. But you have to meet a minimal level of understanding. So it's not enough just to teach them the facts, that they should retain the facts. You have to you must elucidate it for them. I mean, what's the consideration? Well, how could you think differently? You teach something and one doesn't have an understanding, especially because of the profoundness and the applications are so complicated, unless you give them the full understanding of the inner workings and the rationality of that, there's no way to be a beneficiary of that. But Moshe has to be told, you must place it before them, Kishulchan Aruch. How would you think differently? So if Hashem has to say it, evidently there is such a consideration. How is there such a consideration? If you ever look and notice, the early commentators, when they wrote their commentary on Shas, it's written very concise, very short, few words. The later commentators, what the first ones had written maybe to communicate a certain concept, it was maybe a page. Later commentators, they have to write maybe 30 pages. It's a whole different level to come upon, to be able to appreciate and understand the concept. They have to go and literally do an analysis and present it. Otherwise, one doesn't understand and grasp the concepts. But the early ones, they were able to encapsulate it in a concept, in a few words. You know, there's a famous word, Reb Chaim Brisker. Somebody had once come to Reb Chaim Brisker and presented a piece of Torah, his novelé, his insight in a certain subject matter. And Reb Chaim Brisker says to him, "You're not saying it. You're not saying it clearly. I don't understand what you're saying. The way you're saying it, the way you're giving it over." So the person says, "I understand it, but I'm not able to express it because I don't have that ability." So the Reb Chaim Brisker says to them, if you don't have the ability to communicate what you're saying, that means you don't fully understand it. Because if you would understand it as you should understand it, you're able to verbalize what you understand. And if you can't, that means in your own mind, you don't have a clear understanding. That's what Reb Chaim Brisker said to this person. So therefore, if the Torah in its own, so the earlier commentators, because of their dimension of greatness in Torah, the depth and breadth of understanding, in a few sentences, they're able to express, which are volumes. We have literally a minuscule amount of understanding. We have to break through that rock and crush it and sift it to come to the subject matter. It doesn't happen otherwise. And even when we come to the subject matter, it's relative to what they understood, and that's why an Achron, a late authority, cannot argue with a Rishon for that reason. Because the only reason why you're asking the question and disagreeing is just you fully don't understand what the basis of their opinion is. That's why you can't argue with a Rishon for that reason. The Vilna Gaon was the only one who was able to argue with Rishonim, because the Vilna Gaon had surpassed all the level of people of his generation, previous generations, and therefore the Vilna Gaon was able to argue with certain Rishonim, which he did argue for that reason.
Right.
Wait 1 second. Moshe Rabbeinu believed and understood that because of the connection, Klal Yisrael were connected to God. There's a concept known as the Skato Adoros. As we farther ourselves from Sinai, the level of Siyata Dishmaya becomes less and less. It's based on the dimension of the Deshama, whatever it may be. As a result of, because of a level of connection to God is at a lesser level, our level of understanding is less, to a lesser degree. We just come off Sinai. Moshe Rabbeinu felt that because of the level of connection to Hashem, and they were so spiritually attuned, just by giving them the key concepts, they will merit that siyata d'shmaya to be able to delve into it and understand it. Hashem says, no, you have to meet a minimum standard. You have to not only review the facts, you must elucidate it. K'shulchan Aruch. And once you arrange in a Shulchan Aruch for everyone's consumption, now based on each person's dimension of spirituality, he'll be able to take it from there and extend it. But you have to meet a minimum level of understanding, and therefore it has to be K'shulchan Aruch. That was the original consideration of Moshe, and Hashem says, no, that's not what it's all about. You have to bring it to a certain point, and from that point on, then people are able to understand it based on their own capacity. Good. You cannot take the issue before a non-Jewish court, a secular court. Even regarding this particular law, they have the identical laws we have. You're not permitted to steal. And somebody victimized you or did something illegal within the monetary area, and you want to take them to a secular court. You're not permitted to, even though their ruling is identical to your ruling. You're not permitted to bring before their professional judges. If a person takes his case before a non-Jewish court, it's considered you're desecrating Hashem's name. Umaker Hashem halilim lashbicham, and you're esteeming the name of the idolatry to give it that value. Because their rock is not our rock, and our judges, our enemies are the judges. Then when our enemies become our judges and they're able to dominate us, when the non-Jews are able to have the upper hand to take control of the Jew, that he should dictate him, that's a chil Hashem. So if you have a Jewish court and you go to a non-Jewish court, and that's why if a person is not able to go to a Jewish court, let's say the person will not be, his person who he has the claim again will not listen to a Jewish court. He has to get a ruling from a Jewish court to be able to go to a non-Jewish court to adjudicate that law. But it's only if the law is the same law. Now, the way we explained it's very simple. Why? If you're only permitted to take money from another Jew, if the ruling has to have that level of truth on the absolute level, and it's only because Elokim needs up that scale, you can only come to that level of clarity only if it's a Jewish court. because you have to meet all the criteria of Jewish court. Otherwise, for a non-Jew, they're able to legislate and probably whatever laws they want. That's the law of a non-Jew. But for a Jew, it has to be a l'kimnitz das scale. That's the only time the verdict is considered a valid verdict. And since the court doesn't meet the criteria of what a Jewish court is, the level of truth of that judgment is not that. It's not that. I was thinking, as we're speaking, we had mentioned yesterday, the Gemara Sanhedrin, Gemara Shabbos, that a person who renders a truthful judgment, Nasa Shutef Makadosh Baruch Hu Ma'aseh Bereishis. You become God's partner in creation. And if not, the liability of the judge is very severe. God says, I will take his life. So we asked, why, if you render that judgment, why is it so special? And if you go and even take as much as a penny, the Gemara says, the judge has such a level of liability that he deserves, that his life should be taken. So the Medrash explains that initially, what was the intention of creation? Midas Hadin. God wanted to create the world with the attribute of justice. But because God understood that humanity cannot survive Hashem's justice, so therefore he called this within it Midas HaRachmim. However, the world has to have justice. So from Hashem's vantage point, you have to have Midas HaRachmim. Because if there's ever divine justice, there are no survivors. As it says, even the tzaddik is not perfect enough to be able to withstand God's justice. But God says there has to be justice. So what is there? There's human justice. And Hashem sets the courts what human justice is. If they function and they operate within the parameters which Hashem sets. So if there's din lamato, if there's human justice, Hashem says ein din lamalo, then there will not be divine justice. But if there's no din lamato, which is the responsibility of the court, if the courts are corrupt and they don't function as God prescribed they function, then there's din lamalo. Then there'll be divine justice. And if there's divine justice, then we talk about the mabul. There's certain times, but who's liable for having the din lamalo, the divine justice? It's because there's no din lamato, because the judges who are on the terrestrial level are not acting properly and responsibly as they should. Therefore, if the judge renders that truthful judgment, which he considers that it's beyond question in terms of his truthfulness, then he's God's partner in creation. Because due to his rendering that truthful judgment, he prevents divine justice, and the world continues. But if not, then the world goes into jeopardy. It's not the penny, but it's the corrupt ruling verdict. That means there's no human justice. You're already infringing on what justice is. Once you tamper with justice, then God says, if that's the case, it's my justice. That's the understanding. So it comes out this way. We're the chosen nation. When God reigns in on us, there's a tochacha. What is that? It's Chil Hashem. It's Chil Hashem. We read Hazinu. Hashem says, if I wouldn't intervene and ultimately destroy the nations of the world, when you go into exile, you know what they're going to say? That their deities are in control of the world. Because here, God's nation, God's people are being destroyed by us. So Hashem will allow it to go to a certain point. Once it reaches that point, he doesn't let it go beyond that. And ultimately, that's going to be a time of Mashiach. Will he reveal to the world that it's not to what they believed it to be? And then he's going to take revenge for all the Jews who their blood was spilled throughout the ages at the end of time. That's going to be the ultimate judgment against them. But again, why is it a Chil Hashem? If we're the chosen people, and yet they who are idolaters, they have the upper hand, what does that say about us? It means God is not in control. That itself is the Chil Hashem. So going to the non-Jewish court, which is not considered the justice, which is terrestrial justice. Terrestrial justice is only Elokim Nitza Das Kel. If God is associated with that verdict, which is not in the secular court, as a result of that, you're not meeting the criteria of human justice. Therefore, it has to be divine justice. Once there's divine justice, we talk about Chil Hashem, because that you can't be perfect. And who are ultimately, who are the culprits? the Jewish people themselves. Therefore, that's Chil Hashem. Going to the secular court, you're playing giving value to them, meaning they have the upper hand, and we're not able to deal with our own issues. Mar says in Sanhedrin that if unanimously they find the person guilty and deserving of the death penalty, the verdict's not a valid verdict. Why? Because the Torah says v'tzilu ha'eda. The court has to try to save the man. You have to have minimally dissenting opinions who feel the man is innocent. But if unanimously he's guilty, the court cannot issue that verdict. But that's what they say, because God says v'tzilu ha'eda. There has to be some judges seeing him in a positive light that he's not guilty. Only then do you merit that siyata d'shmaya to have that level of clarity, that it's considered truth on an absolute level. You understand? You say, well, we'll go after majority. What's majority? Majority is probability. It's probably correct. No, right? So how do you take a man's life? Well, it's a probability. If there's a minority who just say he's innocent, how do we follow majority? It's only probability. You know why? Because God says that when you can't resolve something and you have probability, you have a right to rule on that. Once you have a right to rule on that, God says, I will give you that level of clarity to issue that verdict. So the man, even if he die, he's put to death, and later you find out that the witnesses or the evidence was faulty evidence, doesn't make a difference. It's Elokim Nitzabat scale. God convened with that court. As a result of that, the verdict was a correct verdict.
Max.